All right. So welcome everyone. Again, apologies for the challenges that got us in here today as we work to get this moving. We are thrilled to have you all joining us today for our newest addition to our virtual events and under our Career Hacks series umbrella, which is tied today to virtual interviewing in the age of COVID. My name is Josh Pruitt. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at the Office of Alumni Relations for UConn. Joining me today are my colleagues, Elissa Kelly, our Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Caitlin Krause, our Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Engineering. The three of us have been working collaboratively with the panel you see here to try and put this webinar and presentation together. Again, best laid plans always have a little bit of bumps in the road, so apologies again for those that are still joining us for the challenges that may have occurred in logging in. On behalf of the UConn Foundation, we're excited for today's discussion. Today's presentation will feature a panel of career and industry experts who hope to shed some light on this new and essential skill for all of your careers and your repertoires. Before we jump in, a few areas to note for you all to go ahead and manage and maximize participation today. There will be an opportunity to ask questions by typing them into the question box on your control panel. Feel free to type those in as you think of them, and we'll try to answer those as best we can today. Given the number of panelists and participants, you can also use the raise your hand aspect. If you see that under your toolbar, you can go ahead and do that. But best way to do that would be to go ahead and use that chat bar right there to ask for questions. Following this event, you'll have a survey that'll be sent out to you as a follow-up. We'd appreciate if you all could go ahead and fill that out for us to let us know how we did today. Obviously, we understand you'll probably have a little bit of initial concern with the way that this went to log in. We appreciate that. And also to let us know what other events you'll be looking for as we build out our inventory of events. This event is being recorded. So if you do have questions or comments, please make sure that they are in somewhat politically correct in this day and age, because they will be obviously shown on our screen and to all additional participants. So please bear that in mind. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce a few of our fantastic panelists. First and foremost, we would like to welcome Victoria DeRosa from Indeed.com. Victoria is also one of our fantastic alumni volunteers for our Arizona Alumni Network. Victoria, you graduated only a few years ago, but we have been working together for quite a few years now, and you've been an involved participant with the Career Development Office since you graduated and your time at Indeed. Prior to today, we were hosting Victoria and John and Beth, as you see, but we had a hero jump into the mix today. Victoria was a little under the weather this morning, so we reached out to Mark Turek, who you see in front of you as well. Kind of last minute. Mark's had about 2 hours to prepare for today's workshop. Mark, we really appreciate you being the hero that saves the day. Mark also is a graduate of UConn, Liberal Arts and Sciences and Economics. Is that correct? As I catch you mouthful of water. From the Center of Career Development, we also have Beth Secchi. Beth is the Associate Director for the Center for Career Development. And she's been with the Career Development Office since 2001. She currently is a self-titled word nerd. She is attentive to how writing well can reflect our talents and promote our skills. She enjoys helping students and alums enhance their marketability through career-related tools such as resumes, cover letters, and LinkedIn. And Beth is married to a UConn alum from Ratcliffe Hicks School, or sorry, should I say, the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. She's the parent of a May 2020 grad from CLES, a history and political science. And she earned her bachelor's degree from Arcadia University, followed by a master's in college student personnel from the University of Maryland. And last, our moderator and our regular panelist to our Career Hacks webinars and Elevate events throughout the country is John Brady. John is an executive coach, keynote speaker for frequent media sources on matters related to corporate and career performance. He has clients all over the globe. He works with senior managers and executives from various companies such as Goldman Sachs, Hewlett-Packard, GE, Apple, Hess, Southwest Airlines, you name it, the list keeps going. Mr. Brady is a 25-year veteran in education, banking, and technology sectors with experience in growing talent and top-line revenue for startups, as well as family-owned businesses, nonprofits, and he's even worked with Fortune 500 or Fortune 50 companies, excuse me. While not a Husky, he is a part of the dog family. He holds a bachelor's degree from Boston University in English education, as well as a master's of education degree in leadership and training and policy studies. He also holds an MBA from Babson. which recognized him as a distinguished alum in 2006. And John's firm, Pro Tem Partners, is the career and management consulting, preferred career management consulting resource for UConn alumni. And so basically, after all of the mouthful, welcome to everyone on our panel today. Thank you all so much for joining us. For those that have just jumped in here, we have about 20 folks that have just joined us since I started reading all the bios. Again, apologies to everyone for the challenges for logging in. You'll hear me say that probably a few more times before this time is done today. But John, obviously the hardest questions need to go to Mark because he's had the most amount of time to prep for this with just under 2 hours. But I'll leave this in your steady hands to get us moving.
Thanks so much, Josh, and thank you to everybody for joining us, for your patience, for everybody on the panel, and especially to Mark for just diving in and saying, sure, I can do this. We appreciate it. And while there'll probably be a lot of overlap in our time today with things that I'd like to think a lot of people know or could look up online pretty easily, we did spend a good amount of time trying to add a little bit more context around that and some of the stuff that you may not always see in the top, listicles of 4 or 5 things that you should and shouldn't do. And just be patient with us. There's different, from a content standpoint, everybody is in a different place. Not everybody has done this before. For some folks, video interviewing of any kind is different. This is something that was really accelerating, and several companies that were only 7 or 8 years ago, tiny little startups that had 7 or 8 employees are now pretty major players in this space. And the COVID-19 situation is just accelerating all of that. And one of the companies I'm thinking of, because I happen to remember meeting those folks when there was, not even 10 people on the payroll, is a company that was doing not so much the kind of direct synchronous video interviewing, but asynchronous video interviewing. And by that, I mean, you get a series of questions in advance. You're able to think about your responses, record them, and usually then submit your responses in your interview almost as like a replacement or even an augmentation to a typical phone screen or initial interview. And all those things are different. So Beth, we'll start with you. Certainly anyone else can dive in. But when you're talking to students and recent alums, what are the things that you really want to make sure they know first about the asynchronous kind of stuff? And then let's talk a little bit more about the one-to-one direct video interviewing live.
Sure. So in general, for the interviewing, you always want to make sure there's certain elements that are consistent regardless of the type, such as the background, are your teeth clean? You don't want that piece of broccoli sticking out of your teeth. So use that time before the interview starts to do the quick, refresh, but really just making sure your environment supports you 100%. So no background noise, no distractions. If you're into the fun backgrounds, we're actually encourage you not to use those right now because your head can disappear and whatnot. It won't serve you well. For an asynchronous one, I think the biggest key, and I definitely will ask my employer colleagues to support this or give your perspective, is to practice. Because sometimes they are timed. Sometimes people only get one chance to do it. So practice, practice, practice. We have on the Career Center's website something called Big Interview, where a person can practice multiple times, regardless if you're a recent alum, a current student, or someone who graduated 20 years ago. You can use that service. You can send the link to anyone to give you feedback. If you're not comfortable looking at your own work, you can ask someone else. But practice, practice, so it feels natural. You don't want to come across as rehearsed or reading from a script that you have a note like behind your camera and you're just staring at it like I'm staring right now. It really needs to be more natural. For the synchronous, I think the big thing is just to be yourself as much as you can, make sure your microphone works, all that kind of stuff. I'm a big hand gesture, and that probably looks really dumb while I'm sitting here. It's going in my face a lot, so I have to make sure to sit right and not use my hands as much. So those are just a few tips that come to mind, but I definitely would like to hear if Mark or Victoria have other thoughts.
For synchronous, one thing that I always like to give a heads up about is to make sure you know what sort of interview you're getting into. So just because it's a person live interview doesn't mean it's going to just be one-on-one. You might have a panel like this where you're talking to multiple interviewers. So that's tricky, trying to make sure you're addressing everybody. You might be doing, if you're in more technical roles, you might be doing a technical project. So the interview will give you directions in your email telling you, hey, have paper ready, have a whiteboard, be prepared to show your responses. So that's one thing I always like to give candidates a heads up for when it is an in-person video interview. Just make sure you know what the video interview is going to consist of. It might not just be a one-on-one. So just preparing for that.
I'd second that. Generally, what we see a lot of across the gamut, we could talk entry level all the way up to senior level roles at the Hartford. You're going to see some level of consistency around how the synchronous interview is executed. Generally, it's via WebEx or Adobe Connect in our space if we need to utilize some sort of whiteboard or see notes as someone is kind of navigating their logic and everything like that throughout the interview. But to the point that everybody's making, I think the most important piece underneath that is kind of bringing your whole self to the interview, being confident in the content that you're presenting, but also thinking about how am I going to deliver that content when there's not actually a physical person sitting in the room with me. The dynamic of that is vastly different. The nerves are different. The preparation is different. And I think it's very integral to take the time to think through that stuff, think through where you've had speed bumps in the past or where you've had successes in the past in those interviews, and how are they going to apply or how are they going to change to doing this over video, or maybe not even over video, because you may run into managers who aren't okay with going on video. So it might be just over the phone the whole time.
And just one last point that I forgot to mention earlier, but we had talked a few times, and today, sorry, Josh, this is a good example. What happens when there's a tech glitch? So if the call gets dropped, the video gets dropped, maybe have that conversation at the beginning of the interview. And if the interviewer doesn't bring it up, as the interviewee, take that responsibility and say, for some reason, if we get disconnected, how would you like to reconnect?
Yeah, that's really just good planning, honestly. And the whole thing about video interviewing, while it does impact people's nerves, things really do look different. And I think in either case, it's easy to focus on the wrong things. It's very easy to get self-conscious. And remember, your goal is to look professional, not necessarily to look attractive, right? You want to look your best, but anything that we're self-conscious about just gets accentuated in a platform like this, because normally we don't have this mirror reflecting back at us the entire time we're in the middle of an interaction, or we're recording something that we know we're going to be sending and in some way evaluated on. And Beth alluded to this, but we talk about interviewing body language and eye contact. Even those things are very, very different in this kind of setting, in this kind of platform. In this case, your eye contact is really looking at a little webcam, pinhole. And while you don't want to stare at it, that's the eye of the person or persons you're interviewing with. It also tends to show other things as well. If you're sitting back in your seat and slouching a certain way, it looks a little different on the camera. When Beth did the sort of gesticulating example, the way the two-dimensional camera captures it, it's like suddenly your hands look bigger in the foreground than they would if you were simply sitting at a conference table, for example, with somebody. So it's a good idea to just practice in front of the camera, walking through some of that. And in addition to some of the other technical things that people mentioned, I always think it's a good idea for you to test just about anything you're going to use as a microphone on a video call with somebody else. Some of these devices will pick up ambient noise more so than others will. It's a microphone, so they're all different. Ideally, I'd prefer not to have these things in my ears, and it looks really clean if I use the mic that's on my computer, but that one just tends to pick up the air conditioning and a lot of other things that you wouldn't even think of. And just make sure if you are interviewing, especially during the COVID period where things are a little weird anyway, while people are very understanding, make sure anyone you share your living space with, where you might be interviewing from, is aware that you've got an interview or just something serious going on. Put a note on the door: do not knock, do not disturb. If you're not doing it in a separate room of some kind. Just, let people know not to be walking behind you or doing anything, awkward like that. I've been doing video conferencing with clients working remotely for a long time now, and I still find myself just making silly mistakes now and then. It just takes some getting used to. So definitely just test all that stuff out. Make sure that as part of your preparation, you've double checked the time zone of all the people who are participating. Something as simple as when your good mornings or good afternoons are, they can be different depending on where people are. Getting the wrong time, now you're feeling a little scattered and ill prepared. Just make sure you've thought about all that stuff as much as you possibly can. Diving in just a little bit further, especially right now, there's still, I mentioned professionalism as opposed to attractiveness, right? At least for interviewing purposes. What guidance are all of you giving to people right now where we're all trying to be really flexible, and I think most interviewers are trying to be flexible. What guidance are you giving to folks about, their attire and other types of preparation for the interview itself that is a little different in the virtual space outside of the technical?
Yeah, so on my end, I know we joked about it in preparation with wearing pants, but that is definitely still something we recommend for virtual interviews. If you can tell, so this is just a simple kind of t-shirt blouse, but making sure at least the top part is presentable. And then as long as it's jeans or slacks, something that if you do need to get up, it's presentable as well, not, gym shorts or your pajamas, just making sure that your entire outfit, no matter if it's visible or not, is ready for the camera.
So no Yeti hats for interviews. So joking aside, same thing for us, really. My approach to prepping candidates for these types of interviews is just to say, treat it as such you were going into the office. Do all the same level of preparation from your appearance and how you get yourself ready for it. You're just not going to leave your house for it. So I don't think there's a secret sauce. I think there's situations when managers might dial on and they might be dressed like I am right now. And we need the candidates to be aware of that and okay with that, and to understand that, maybe they have other things going on right now and they didn't have the time to prep, professionally for the interview. And we shouldn't be holding that against them or feel like, they're not upholding the advice that we're providing to the candidate coming into it. But long story short, it's just prep the same way that you would going into an in-person interview.
The only thing I'd have to add to that is, so again, we're so much closer now. So I have really big hair, and I have to make sure to maintain it. So if I'm playing with my hair, it will explode. And again, that would look very bad in an interview. And I also put on my glasses during this. These are just eye strain glasses. So I've noticed being on the stream where I need the blue light glasses. So if you know that you need something like that, put it on before the interview versus during the middle of it, like I did. Or just look at glares, make sure you're in, we can see John really nicely with the window behind him, but sometimes he'll sit in front of a window and they're all really dark in shadow. So just really practice, but I like the way Mark expressed it. It's an interview, right? So think about how you want to present your best self for an interview and then just replicate it in this environment.
One of the things that in a video platform can often feel very different, and I talk with clients about this a lot in interviewing typically, but that is, you get a question and you need to think about the answer and there's a pause. A pause can feel eternal in an interview setting as a candidate. I think that's even more pronounced on this kind of a platform. What's your thinking and your guidance about the best way to handle those kinds of moments where you get a question and you need a little bit of time to think?
I think just having the wherewithal to have situational awareness to say ooh, that's a really tough question. Give me a minute to think about that. But to your point, you don't want it to feel like there's this stare down standoff on the call, right? So I think maybe looking away for a quick second, jotting a note or two down, gathering your thoughts, but also being mindful of how much time you're spending doing that. Taking a moment to think through a more difficult question shouldn't turn into a 5-minute pause. I think we're thinking more along the lines of, 20 to 30 seconds thinking through things and then make a comment. Maybe it's an update. Could you repeat the question or something along those lines? But, I think it's being mindful of how much time you're taking on that, but also having the wherewithal to being okay with saying, hang on a second. I need a second to gather my thoughts. Give me a moment here and, kind of go at it from that angle.
And I agree with you, Mark. I also wouldn't do that more than twice. Like, to me, once is preferred, not every question. And sometimes restating the question out loud gives your brain time to answer while your mouth is doing something else.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. There's a difference between how much time passes and your own perception of time. So on the one hand, it can feel like a really long time. On the other hand, yeah, you want to be aware of how much time is actually going by. Once or twice, yeah, is probably about right. But most folks, the mistake that they make in almost any interview setting, at least I find, at least in Western society anyway, we're terrified of pauses and of silent moments. And you can ask for the permission to do that. I would rather somebody give a thoughtful answer, because if you just start rambling at the mouth, which I think you're far more likely to do on a video platform, even if you don't say necessarily anything inappropriate, I don't know that it always comes out as eloquent as you would hope. And then you're stuck kind of feeling like, you want to kick yourself afterwards, wishing that you could have a do-over with it. So, once or twice, if there's something that you just didn't anticipate, or you just want to make sure you sequence your thoughts right, it's totally fine to ask for several seconds, as long as it is no more than a few seconds. And the other thing that you can do, assuming that it appears the interviewer is okay with it, you have to make sure you're reading the virtual room a little bit. If the interview turns into more of a volley of questions and a conversation where you're getting to ask some questions and they're responding and it's more conversational, there's less of a need for those pauses because it lets you off the hot seat. I think most people presume that their job in an interview is to just sit there and wait for whatever's incoming. And sometimes that is what's expected. And if so, usually it'll be pretty clear. But if there is more of a conversational flow, it allows your breathing to slow down a little bit. It changes your sense of at least the degree of power imbalance or perceived power imbalance in the situation. And it just gets more comfortable. But even those pauses can be good just for breathing. 2 or 3 not obvious deep breaths where people can see your whole torso expanding, just enough so that you can kind of slow yourself down, because your mind is going a lot faster than anything else. And you really want to make sure that if it takes you an extra 5 or 7 seconds to come up with a good, thoughtful response and give the interviewer the information that they need, all the better. But I just think that makes sense. Speaking of questions, how do you suggest people prepare for questions differently, if at all, in a virtual platform versus questioning that they might engage in or plan for in a typical interview in person?
Advice has been the same, of just preparing 2 to 5 questions for the interviewers. I always say 5 just in case they cover some of your earlier questions. You still have backups. The only thing you might do differently is if there is, I know some roles are flagging that they're COVID remote, or because of the situation, there's a difference in the responsibility or the location. That's the only way I would prepare a little bit differently. If there is something like that flagged on the job description, just noting that, but still have those questions unrelated to Corona, COVID, have those prepared like a regular interview. And then if there is anything that needs to be specific because of the situation going on now, have those as well.
I'd second that, stated perfectly. I think the common theme that you'll probably hear from both of us through some of this stuff is that a lot of the preparation should remain the same in how you're thinking through some of these things and laying out your questions. Asking no questions is still a horrible outcome and should not be something that happens. But like Victoria said, prepping some kind of go-to questions that you can start off of and then building out from there You know, and maybe think about how that might shift as you're having the conversation and things come up. There may be questions that arise that you aren't even thinking about right now.
We often have students that ask us, I don't know what to ask. Like, they are just always struggling. So one way is to go back to the mission statement of the company culture, look at their website, review the job description. Perhaps you are anticipated a question coming that didn't. You can then reframe it and ask it out to them. So go back to the sources that you have to come up with those 2 to 5 questions. And as Victoria said, definitely having more is better. You don't have to ask them all, but you want to have enough in your queue that if it's covered, you're not scrambling at the end. And you just don't want to say, oh, I had questions, but you answered them all. That kind of sounds lame.
The other thing that it just sort of occurred to me as we've been chatting here, we talk about what's ideal in a video setting. Most of us are not in an ideal situation. I think virtual backgrounds end up generally being distracting, but if you just happen to be in a living situation where there is no appropriate backdrop that you'd feel comfortable using, as long as you can test it out, maybe it's worth trying. Just nothing that's going to be goofy or distracting. Certainly if the tech isn't working right and you're finding that it's cutting off part of your head, or when I use more my noise canceling headsets and I'm on one of those, I kind of look like Princess Leia because the camera is taking a different outline of my head against the background, and it just, whereas if I were to just wear it with my actual background, it wouldn't matter. Beth mentioned I have a window behind me. Normally we say don't do that, but I'm in a room where there's, it's a corner room and there's just a really hard way to find another angle. So, you do the best you can with the space that you have and to make the best possible presentation that you can. One thing we haven't mentioned, but it comes up a lot, do think about where the webcam is. If you can have it at around eye level, or even just a couple of inches above eye level, you're better off a little higher than a little lower. If you're on a laptop, you're looking down. And not only would that make you feel uncomfortable seeing yourself, people are looking up at your face in just a way that doesn't seem quite as natural. That's usually easy to fix. I mean, books, a cardboard box, it doesn't matter. Something that's likely to just bring that up a little bit. The more that you can bring, in order to try and compensate for the window behind me, you can't see it, but I've got like these bright lights around me, because otherwise my face would get darkened and shadowed out. I mean, do whatever you can, but especially during COVID, most folks are aware that there isn't a perfect scenario. I mean, I've been watching journalists on the news and they're in their bedrooms, and there's something that feels a little creepy to me about that, about them being in a bedroom, knowing that's where they lay their heads at night. But, you've only got so many rooms, probably, to wherever you're living. I don't want everybody, because of their situation, to feel like just because they don't have a perfect, studio set up at home, no one is expecting you, no one you'd want to work for anyway, is expecting you to have a setup in your residence that would rival a YouTuber, Instagram influencer here. You just want to obviously have made your best to make everything as professional overall as you possibly can, and everybody's learning. So are there any topics from the panel that we had discussed in our prep that maybe I just neglected to ask? Sometimes as I jump around, I miss things when moderating. Nothing?
Key
Not
points.
seeing anything at the moment.
Great. The only other thing, of course, that comes up is just like with any interview, once you get toward the end, make sure that you thank everybody, make sure that you have people's contact information. Right now, remember that because there's more video interviewing at scale than there had been prior, everyone's system is a little off. Many of the folks who could be interviewing you are very likely working from home themselves. So simple things that would have been part of a process if you were coming in to the office for an interview can easily get lost in the shuffle. It's just a lot you don't want to miss out on, is the opportunity to get your thank yous and follow-ups out. And with everything being a little off, just make sure you've got that on your checklist. You can always have that in there someplace. You can do it as part of your prep in advance or afterwards. what I usually advise, certainly beforehand, is if you get a moment, make sure to ask how the names are pronounced if you're unsure of the people that you're interviewing with. It's just a really important courtesy. Most folks don't take the time to do that. If someone is used to having their name mispronounced, they're likely to be very misunderstanding, but they'll also notice when someone makes that extra effort. And again, everything just gets pronounced more in certain ways in this kind of a medium. And certainly things like that, just hearing it over an earpiece or a microphone, it makes a difference. But most importantly, at the end, that you've got people's contact information, emails, so that you can send whatever follow-up, or if it's supposed to go to one point person and it's the company's preference to not give out everybody's contact information, just an assurance of who's going to pass on your notes afterwards makes a lot of sense. I think we've hit the highlights for most of it. Beth, if there's anything, I see your hand going up.
Yep, I just thought of something too. I thought of it earlier and then forgot, and now remembered again. And this I really want to turn to Mark and Victoria a little bit on. So in a live interview, we would often tell interviewees to arrive about 10 minutes before, not much more than that, because then there's that anxiety in the waiting room, and it can, if the prior interview hadn't ended yet, it can be awkward for the interviewer. But in this remote world, I feel like if someone shows up 10 minutes early to one of these, it sends a different message. So I was thinking like 5 minutes before is fine, but I was curious what you thought as the interviewer. And then I know some systems allow people to test their virtual prior to the interview, so I'd encourage people to do that as well. But as the interviewer, as Mark and Victoria, when are you looking for people to arrive in the waiting room?
So we have teams that actually test the connections with the candidates before the interviews. And this ring true even before the whole COVID situation, just because there's always challenges. I mean, we saw it today, getting into the WebEx today. So it's very feasible that that's going to happen frequently when you're trying to log into interviews. What you want to try to minimize in that situation is that flustering you and throwing off your preparation leading up to that point. So giving yourself some time to do that beforehand is very essential. I think I agree with you on the scenarios when we're not actually laying out login at this time. 5 minutes is probably plenty. But in a lot of cases in our world, across the spectrum, again, from entry level to senior level at the Hartford, we're really going the extra mile to lay all of that stuff out line by line. You know, this is how you log in. This is when you're going to be prompted to enter the password. This is when you should log in. You know, expect the manager to log in at this time. So it's really kind of laying it all out in black and white for you to just kind of carve the path and make it easy to just pick up the phone, dial, turn the computer on, turn the video on, and get after it. So.
Yeah, I would agree with the 5 minutes. We don't have a team that will get ready ahead of time and test it with you beforehand. But when you get the link of your confirmation email, you can access the link at any point. So we call out to test it ahead of time, click the link, log in. Sometimes you need to download an extension or you need to download the app. So just make sure you're testing it ahead of time. We do call that out. And then we recommend 5 minutes ahead of time. If you want to sit with your camera off so you don't feel self-conscious, you can do that, but just making sure you're present, waiting, ready to go when they are logging in.
Oh, that's such a good point, Victoria. You said log in and then turn the camera off. I was doing a virtual student appointment and we both were in the site. So I thought, but it turned out I got the page ready, but then actually didn't hit the login. So the student finally was like, are you there? And I was like, of course, let's both log off and log in. And then when I did it the second time, I said, oh, I got it all prepped, but I didn't hit check in. So it's really important that you check in.
That's actually a good point. It's something that we've learned over the last couple of months in panel interviews over video is that the manager who's talking goes on camera. When they're off camera or when they're not asking a question and the candidate is talking, like let's say there's 3 managers on the call. Beth, you ask the question, I'm answering you. The other 2 managers who are on turn their camera off because we've found that it actually can throw people off and pull your eyes in different directions. And then you start caring about the body language of someone who you're not necessarily addressing at that point. So I think that's a really good point, Victoria, of just shutting it down. I think a lot of managers are starting to get, because people we've noticed on conference calls, at least, that people don't want to stare at each other for an hour, so they'll shut down and they'll come on when they want to talk. So you'll start to see that more in interviews. And I know at the Hartford, we're seeing it a lot, especially in our panel interviews. And another thing that I just wanted to mention from the early login, like prep time, if you're a technical candidate, there's likely, Victoria, you mentioned this before with a whiteboard, there's likely going to be a whiteboard coding logic exercise or something like that you may have to go through, which can add some added complexity to the login functions. So what I mean by that is, for us, when we are going down the route of doing coding logic exercise, we need a tool that has a whiteboard embedded in it. We don't want someone with a whiteboard behind them writing down on dry erase. So we're using a tool called Adobe Connect, which has a far more complex login process than WebEx, Zoom, GoToMeeting, all of these. It's got several steps to it, and it's always got issues. So be mindful of those things too, where there might be some added complexities to the interview that maybe you don't see right away, that you're going to need to be aware of when you get onto it.
I just realized before we turn to questions from our attendees, I knew there was one I was forgetting. We had in prep talked a little bit, and this goes really for just about any interview setting, but maybe feels even more so in this environment. What candidates should be thinking about and how they should approach a situation where, quite frankly, their interviewer isn't very good. Not everybody has learned how to interview well. And there are a lot of hiring managers who might be new to it, or they think they interview really well and maybe not so much. And it can be really hard to know how to handle that as a candidate. What thoughts do you have, Beth? I'm going to start with you, but we can go round robin real fast.
Sure. I think, and we discussed this in the prep, so I'm sorry if I'm stealing someone else's thought, that you still have to do your best, be your best self. So try to answer the question and try to focus on what's being asked, even if it's asked in a really awkward way, or if their body language is kind of going quirky, just really focus on what you need to do to demonstrate your capability.
Yeah, exactly what Beth said, and going off of it, just making sure you're focused on your portion. But like we mentioned, this is all new to everybody. So the video aspect might be uncomfortable for the interviewer. Mark says, they're turning off cameras. They're trying to limit their visibility. So it might just be uncomfortable for them too. So don't take it personally. Just worry about your response, hearing the question that they're asking, and then getting your point across in the best way possible. That's really all you can focus on, and just try not to let it stump you too much.
As we sort of, go ahead, Mark.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that, when you fall into that situation, like, look at that as an opportunity, right? Like, you can shine even more because someone's not hammering you into the corner with questions. It might end up being a little bit of an easier interview. So that it just kind of rings more true to having that really solid prep going in and knowing what are my like 5 to 10 strong selling points about what I bring to the table. And I'm going to hammer that home with this person, and they're going to walk out of here thinking I'm the best candidate that they've talked to. And I think when you have a situation where someone is a more entry-level interviewer, it becomes a little bit easier of a situation for the candidate than it does for the manager.
I would agree with that for sure. And as we sort of transition here, just sort of a disclaimer, the purpose of our time, obviously, is to focus on video interviewing, and particularly video interviewing while we've got the COVID-19 kind of economic suppression going on and activity suppression going on. There's just a lot that's very different. But my guidance, and I think most of my colleagues would agree with me, the goal of this is not to get you overly obsessed and focused about the aspects of the technology and viewing. We don't want anything to distract, but remember, it's still the substance of your responses, of what you know, of what you can bring, of your value proposition, of the totality of your professional experience. If, like most of the folks I deal with, they've been in the workforce for a long time, those things all still weigh far more heavily on how this is going to go than a lot of the sort of window dressing things we're talking about. It's not that they're unimportant. It's just that we don't want those things to, in small ways, keep detracting from your candidacy and from what you can bring to an employer. So do remember, the point of the interview is really about your conversation and about your responses and your questions. All of this, it's secondary. It's very important secondary, but don't do all this other prep at the expense of what matters most. With that, Josh, I know I've been seeing questions in the pop up in the panel. I'm going to let you kind of sort through them here a little bit and kind of either lump them together or sequence them however you think is best.
Sure, and thank you so much for all of your insight, everybody. For those that have joined us since we kicked off today, we have over 90 participants now today, so that's fantastic. And our apologies, as I mentioned to those that were on here earlier, you hear me say this a few more times, for any of the challenges and struggles you had logging in. You've heard us address a couple of times already. Some of those challenges that can affect even logging into interview. Different web platforms have different hurdles that they have to jump. Unforeseen circumstances pop up, tech issues happen. So we just appreciate your patience and your wherewithal to work through it and get here to join us today. As a reminder, if you did miss the intro parts of this or jumped in midway, this is being recorded. So we will be able to share the link of this at a later date. So just stay tuned for that. But John, getting back to our point at this time, we do have a number of questions that have come in. The first one is, what are some key questions that you should be asking employers during a virtual interview? Are there standards that you would always recommend in this scenario that may be different from others?
I'll turn to others. For my purposes, I don't know that they'd be any different in a virtual setting than they would be in another setting, but it's a good question and worth asking. We shouldn't make assumptions. Have any of you either experienced anything that just made you think, oh, that is kind of an interesting question or a different approach, or heard of someone from a candidate where an interviewer maybe asked a question of them that you normally wouldn't get outside of a virtual environment?
We're getting a lot of questions around just the general impact of it. How's the transition to being 99% remote, 20,000 employee company gone for you guys? And I think it's a really good question. I think a lot of employees of the company are generally going to be passionate about talking about that because we've experienced this insane shift that happened virtually overnight and is uncharted waters for us. So it's very easy for the employer to talk to those things because we're being regularly updated on it. So I think that probably for me has been the biggest question, just to understand the challenges and impacts. And people have asked us if it's caused layoffs, if it's canceled positions, if we've canceled programs. And the long and short of that is business as usual. Just like kind of the core of what we're talking about here with the interview, where there's this different norm where we almost like lifted up everything that we had here in the office, moved it over here and dropped it down in our house and just continued on. So generally it's really just focused on that, how it's impacted us. Everything else been generally the same.
Yeah, I would second that. I would say, like you mentioned, John, prep questions, everything should kind of go same as usual. The only questions we've been getting are around how we've responded. So
I think you need to know your stakeholders, right? So I work in higher ed, I work on a college campus. So the questions in my office are going to be more like, how are students being served? Or how is the university responding to X? I would also ask people to not ask questions that are very easily found on a website or in the news. So that's also key. Like, so to ask us, oh, do you know if you're teaching in the fall? Will you be on campus in the fall? That's been widely shared on our website, in the news, that no, I don't know yet. So I'd rather you ask something that isn't so easily found out.
The only other question I can think of is more of a technical one, and that is at the beginning or with your first response, if it comes to it. Sometimes something as simple as just saying, can everybody, especially if there's more than one person you're talking to, can everybody hear me okay? Can everybody see me okay? And just sort of look for the thumbs up or the nods. It's not so much, yes, you want to make sure that the tech is working all right, but it shows that you care enough about it to make sure that the other person isn't straining to sort through something. And, while you may not be the one on the platform who can fix it, if somebody else is, they can, at least you've drawn attention to that. It just shows an overall awareness, like a situational awareness, that I think is probably wise. Josh?
I was going to say there's a similar question that came in that has a little bit of resonance here to this scenario. is that in these interviews that folks are starting to find themselves in now in the virtual world, one person has a question that they have started to hear that employers are actually asking interviewees how they're handling COVID. Is this something that you are hearing? Is there a proper response to that? Is that, and to what degree are they looking at analyzing that answer that could affect your employment?
I'll turn to my panelists first.
That feels more like a conversational type of question. Um, I struggle seeing that as like, we need to make sure that we ask every candidate that comes through this process how they're handling COVID, and we're going to pull data points from that when we're getting to the decision-making table. I don't see us asking that. I haven't heard of anybody asking that before. And again, my gut, it feels like a conversational type of question, like end of interview, like how has this all impacted you type of conversation.
Yeah, I agree. It's either more conversation or just that human moment of reaching out to the person on the other side. And it's kind of the professional version of, hey, how are you doing? Without like digging too deep or going too deep. It's just sort of a recognition that everybody's going through something they've never gone through before.
Next question that's come in. How do you address the fact that you are currently interviewing with your current employer and that they may be contacted by another potential employer to alleviate the concept that they may be feeling that you were abandoning ship during the struggles of COVID?
Any of my panelists want to go first?
Sure. I know that if a person is doing a job search, they can always request it to be confidential, at least at certain levels. So I would start with that. And then if they're at the point where they can address, I believe, and my colleagues definitely speak to this, that the candidate can say, if I'm in your finalist or I'm in one of your close to offer, then yes, I'd like to have a conversation with my supervisor about this. So it comes from me and not just randomly from outside. And then I think you approach your supervisor and speak to the reasons that you're job hunting, just as if you would if it wasn't COVID. But I know it can be risky for certain industries. Once that's disclosed, the employer may not be so happy to have you on their team anymore. So I know it can be very dicey. But I think as far as Josh, what you asked, like abandoning ship, I don't think it's about that. You ultimately have to do, how can you be of best service to your current employer or your future employer? And that's what it comes down to, that you want to make sure you're being the best employee possible.
Yeah, I don't worry too much about this seeming like sort of some tone deafness or a lack of care for the employer that you've worked with and worked for and supported. But even through crises, other aspects of life do continue to go forward. And that includes people's careers. In the 75-ish days or so since we really started slowing things down, 4 of my clients have, gone out and either already started new jobs or at least, finalized their offers, which also shows that there is some hiring going on. Hiring is a lot slower than it was, a lot more competitive, but even there, people are still advancing and moving forward. And it's not that they don't care. It's not that, they don't necessarily think well of their employer. They're going to try, I'm sure, to leave well as they would anyway, with whatever caveats that means in the COVID situation that might make it a little bit harder. Onboarding a new employee is really tricky in this environment with people remote, and leaving an employer is a little bit more tricky. So I think it's more about doing it all really well. But there are probably very, very few jobs where people would, with any legitimacy, feel that you were somehow doing them a disservice by leaving them during this period. And I'm sorry, Mark, I think we started talking at the same time.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in our process at the Hartford, we generally aren't checking references until the offer has been accepted. So at that point, the bet is made. The move is happening, and we're not calling direct supervisors. So when I got a job at the Hartford, my recruiter didn't call my supervisor at my last company. They called our HR department, who did a work verification. It was dates of employment, position, and eligibility for rehire. Character references are a thing of the past. Major employers, as we've all seen, they unleash risk. And so, it's typically general information and it's usually pushed to an HR department. So I think I would also think about that aspect of it too. This day and age, unless you're a high level executive, your direct supervisor is probably not going to get contacted through that.
Yeah, I'll just second what Mark was saying. We do it once you've accepted an offer. So it's at that point you've accepted the offer. So the conversation is going to happen no matter what. But if it is something that's concerning at the beginning of the process, just ask your recruiter, clarify. It's never a bad idea to check. Because if you are really that concerned about it, it's worth confirming. Then you don't have to, have a conversation earlier than you need to with your current supervisor.
The other thing with that too, Victoria, is that you guys probably have this as well, where you can say no to contacting my previous employer. The background investigations team is going to ask you for an explanation as to why they can't contact your previous employer. And we do, in fact, run into a lot of situations that say, I just don't want them to know yet. I work in sales. If they find out that I'm looking at another job, they're going to fire me before that new job starts. So it's always okay to have a conversation with the recruiter when the other, background investigators and other individuals that manage the back end process to get you to that start date get involved. It's just being vocal about it, being open about why we don't want to contact them. And they'll work with you on kind of keeping their foot over the brake until that moment comes that they have to make that call.
Right, moving on to the next question. Yeah. And we could do an entire session, John, and you're right, talking about onboarding during COVID. Talk about a beast to tackle.
It's been an interesting few months for several of them. I mean, I'm glad they got their new jobs, but it's been tricky for the new employee, and it's been tricky for the employer on so many different levels. But yeah, it's everybody's working through it.
So we do have just under 5 minutes left to the allotted time that we've scheduled. Can our panelists hang out for a few more minutes and answer a few more questions? So those of you that do have questions, if there are still a few more that are milling about, go ahead and type those in. We'll try to tackle as many as we can. For those of you that need to jump off, this is being recorded again, so we'll be able to share as this kind of moves forward. One other question that did come in is in regards to headgear. Obviously, when you're using earphones like I'm using, AirPods like John, or over-the-ear headphones like Victoria, what is more preferred? Is it better to be in a situation like Beth or Mark where they're not utilizing one, or is it more preferred or professional? Oh, look, they're hidden. You didn't even see it. So it must have been lost in the beard, Mark.
That's his Lester Holt anchor desk.
That's it. Yeah. So where does it go? Right? Where does it go? Which direction is the best way to do it? Which is more professional? And is there a preference, or does it not matter?
I think John kind of touched. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say John kind of touched on it earlier with whatever's going to sound the best, you're going to hear the best. As long as the technology is working and functional, whatever you need to do, our interview team won't care if you have anything in your ears or on your ears. As long as they can hear you, you can hear them. That's all that really matters.
Go to your background noise. I would love to sit outside. It would be much prettier, be a nicer, brighter environment. But cars are driving by, someone's cutting the grass. So I think that's what we have to pay attention to. It's the clarity and the outside noises that are beyond our control.
Yeah, you want to make sure that you can hear them clearly, that they can hear you clearly. If it's wireless, you want to make sure you're using one that doesn't tend to drop a lot, that if it doesn't have a replaceable battery, isn't so old that the battery runs out really fast and you're in those last few minutes of the interview. Those are the things that are going to be most important. Certainly, I would, in a perfect world, I would love to not have anything in my ears or on my head, or at least not visible. But I think, again, remember what's really important here, and that is that you can get through the interview running its natural course, and that everybody can communicate effectively. And if that means that we have to have some funky things on around our ears, or even a wire someplace, then so be it.
So next question coming in, can you talk a little bit about body language? Obviously, we know when we're doing virtual interviewing, you're seeing basically from the head up, or the shoulders up, I mean. What is the best way to kind of convey? I'm a hand stalker, so you'll see me do this. I know you talked about Beth doing something similar earlier, but getting close enough to the camera as my hands kind of move. What do you recommend? How do you engage people, obviously, in the same manner you would in an in-person versus a virtual?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I had to unmute. We did some interviews recently and a thought came through. We want people to show that they're confident, have energy. If someone's kind of talking in this flat monotone or it's really important that people sit up straight and answer, have tonal inflection, just show enthusiasm for the opportunity. An interview is a gift. People get so nervous about interviews, but if we can reframe it that I have this chance to share with you my skill set, and yes, it's sort of uncomfortable to talk about myself. However, it really is the chance for me to make my own first impression. And so if we can look at that without being intimidated by that, it's sitting up tall, being positive, and continually demonstrating you're enthusiastic and want the position you're seeking. I think that will carry quite far.
The other thing I'm thinking of is depth perception overall with webcams is it doesn't look the same, which is why when Beth did that example of hand gestures before, a hand gesture closer to you, it doesn't seem as strange as if it closes more of the distance. I mentioned earlier the ideal height of the webcam itself. One of the things that you can do if you've got it either at eye level or just a couple of inches above, and test this with your particular web camera. But if you've ever sat for a portrait, like if you were at a wedding or something like that, or even like a school photo, sometimes the position the photographer will have you in doesn't feel very natural, but they're compensating for the way the lens captures you. And one of the things that I've found can work a little bit is I make sure not to slouch, but I actually lean forward a little, not too much, because then it's kind of creepy. But if I just bring my head forward, my chin forward a little bit, from a body language standpoint, it seems to suggest a little bit more focus. It also aesthetically can often help you look a little bit better, but most importantly, it gives a little bit of room so that no matter how much moving you do back and forth, it gets masked by that a little bit if your head is coming forward, not your whole body, just kind of your chin in a way that might feel just a little different than the way you might normally sit. One other thing to notice, and I didn't realize this until I had to do, this was years ago, but it was my first time ever doing a thing on TV. It was no big deal. It was like community television, but it was live. It was like a talk show situation. And because the chairs rotated, kind of like my desk chair does, I didn't realize how much nervous energy I was putting into having the chair going back and forth. And it wasn't dramatic. It's not like I was playing, and swiveling around dramatically in it, but the camera captured it a lot more. So it, on the screen, when I looked at the recording, it was far more noticeable. So what I learned at that point is next time I asked for a chair that wouldn't move. But just little things like that from a body language standpoint that can help. Was it Mark? Did I hear someone else's voice?
You just made a few of the points I was gonna make, so you covered what I was gonna bring up.
My bad, sorry.
No worries at all. You said it great.
When you get a meeting of the minds together, sometimes the minds all meld together at once. We'll do probably two more questions from what it looks like here. What you kind of alluded to this a little bit already. One of the things that people are concerned about is obviously to the monotone aspect of a conversation. Sometimes you're not sure if it's being received well. Is there a way that you can use virtual interviews and prepare yourself or position yourself to make it much more conversational as opposed to just answering the question by question by question, where it just feels a little bit too businesslike and not enough about who you are and the energy you might have for that position?
I would speak to the length of the answer. So if someone asks me a close-ended question, which hopefully you're not getting a lot of them, but sometimes that happens, I'm not just going to say yes or no. I'm actually going to say yes and then go on with a story, about a minute and a half, not a 5-minute story, to help make it more of a dialogue. So that would be my thought, is to make sure you're answering questions in a way that allow for either a follow-up question to occur. And it's not because you answered too vague. It's just because the interviewer is so intrigued by what you said, they'd like to have more information.
Yeah, the one other thing that I've often told clients, and this is, I think, a little easier for folks who've been in the workforce for a little while. Certainly, the more senior you are, the easier this is. But if it, as long as again it doesn't, you're not getting the sense that you're throwing off their process, you can conclude your answer to their question by asking a situationally appropriate question of them. You know, so if somebody were to say, I don't know, they were supposed to ask you about an example of a particular marketing plan or something that you put together. You could ask a marketing plan related question or initiative related question. Once you've answered their question, you don't use it as a way of dodging, but it's a segue, something along the lines of it. Now that you mentioned that, I actually had a question about that, and you can feel them out. They'll tell you if they say, you know, can you hold your questions to the end? But more often than not, the interviewer prefers it in a lot of situations, because now it's starting to feel more like a real conversation because it actually is, and it's a lot more. It's a lot better proxy for what it might be like to work with you in an office environment or in a team environment than you just kind of sitting there waiting for the next question. You know, you read people as best you possibly can, but not only would I say it's easier the later you are in your career, in some cases it's even more expected that you do something other than just kind of let them do all the work. You're good managers, and particularly executives, I don't know how many people on the call are mid to late career. It's expected that as a leader, you often have more questions than you do answers. And sometimes the best leaders, it's not their job to have all the answers. It's to ask questions of their people, know the subject matter experts they have on their team, get differing points of view, just to be really aware of what's going on in their division or in the business or the organization. So that's another way that you can kind of shift that dynamic a little bit.
We'll throw out another question that did come in, because obviously it's a follow-up to our body language conversation. How do you read the interviewer's body language?
That's a good one. I haven't really spent any time thinking about it. I don't know if any of my colleagues here have.
I haven't either, but you know, the first thing that comes to mind is how you talk about mirroring in face-to-face interviews, you know, and mirroring kind of the body language of the people in the room and mirroring how they're acting and things like that. And I mean, I would think, just like we're talking about in other aspects of preparation for a virtual interview and execution of a virtual interview, the same would ring true for reading the body language. And this doesn't mean if they're slouched back, like you should be, you know, hopping on the recliner to conduct your interview. But I think reading them, understanding kind of how they're positioned, how they appear on the screen, and trying to do your best to mirror some of that is probably the best approach to it.
That's a good thought. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Also, I would say, like, if you've noticed throughout the call, a lot of the panelists are nodding or smiling or engaging as you're speaking. So just watching for that, that's another way to tell at least they're paying attention, they're listening, they understand what you're saying. That's another way I would say is probably an easy win to see that they at least are paying attention.
Thank you all for that. So as we go to wrap up, what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to start sharing some information on your screen. Hopefully this works out and we don't get crashed. So give us 1 second. Hopefully you see on the screen now some additional contact info and additional resources that we are providing. We will be providing you all an additional email full of resources, both from Indeed.com as well as our Center for Career Development. But on the screen, you should have contact information for John, Mark, and Victoria, and Beth. So please feel free to email them at any time. They're always willing. They've been so willing to be open and available for all of you. Obviously, with a panel full of alums and career experts, we live in a world of Huskies helping Huskies, and this is truly one of those times where we all need to work together to try to enhance that. As we close, I do want to thank everybody for joining us. We do have one final question for each of our panelists, and it actually comes from me this time. So I'm going to go over to Victoria as the guinea pig first here, and I'm going to ask you if you could give one more piece of advice, the final thing that you would say that folks need to be aware of, prepared for, or information that they need to go ahead and research before they get into this. what would you say?
I would say just checking the resources that you have. So with career services, shameless plug for Indeed, there's lots of information out there, especially with what's happening. Lots of how to do video interviews, how to ask about COVID and coronavirus and how businesses are handling that. So just looking online and exploring, there's a lot out there. So I would just take advantage of that. Looking for remote jobs, you can search that. That's another thing that you can do if that's something that you're looking for. So just really using what's out there. It's not no need to recreate the wheel. There's a lot of information already available.
Perfect, thank you. And Mark, to give you some more time, I'm going to throw it over to Beth. I know you didn't have time to prepare for this question, but everybody else did. So Beth, what would you say would be that last piece of information that you would say are must-haves or research information before going into this?
Sure. And Victoria, thank you for reminding people that we have a website. So feel free to go on the website. There's an incredible, exhaustive amount of information. Under interviewing, you can do practice interviews with us. You can do that big interview virtual medium. So I would say utilize our resources, meet with career coaches like myself. And then the last bit of advice would be not so much about our resources, but just coming back to the whole point of this conversation. When you're in an interview, answer the question. Been on many, many interviews where the candidate either rambles, like John was talking about, because they're nervous, or they just don't know what they want to say, or whatever the reason, but they wind up skirting the issue, answering in a very vague way. So if you're unsure of what's being asked, always clarify, but at the end of the day, please answer the question. I can tell you over the years how many times I've written on my notes under my questions, did not answer, and that person does not move forward. So I don't mean to answer on a negative. Answer the question so you are the candidate of choice. There we go.
Very nice. And before turning into one of our next panelists, I do want to remind audience members today as well that as alums of the university, you have access to a number of different resources. For those that are more recent grads, within 3 years of graduation, you have access to all the same resources that you did as a student through the Center for Career Development. So definitely take a look at the career.uconn.edu website. Check out all the different things that are there. You will even have opportunities to connect with Beth or colleagues within her office for resume reviews, consultations about job searching, and utilizing the tools that are available through the UConn Center for Career Development. So definitely encourage you to do that. Moving past that, after that 3-year point, you do have access to John Brady and Pro Tem Partners for a free 90-minute consult as well, which that could include resume reviews. It could also include additional focus conversations about moving your job search forward or preparing yourself for whatever that career or management move would be. Additionally, and I don't want to forget this, you are still allowed post that 3-year mark to have a 1-hour consult with career development for free. Beyond that, then you have to look into the payable rates that the Center for Career Development charges to that beyond state. And then similar for John, beyond that 90-minute, you would get a discount for being a UConn alum for his services through his firm. Mark, you're up next, so I will turn it over to you. What's the last piece of advice or resources that you would recommend?
Bringing us home here. So I could probably rattle off a whole bunch of stuff here, but I like Victoria's point of utilizing the resources that we have. I mean, we've experienced it in all of our contingency planning for our shifting due to COVID, right? And a lot of the information that we've been able to find on what other companies are doing are through message boards like Reddit, and people actually advertising what is happening in these other places. So don't be afraid to go to some of those discussion boards and like type in, interviewing at the Hartford. You would be very surprised what you might find out there. Glassdoor is another one where people will actually post interview questions and, might even have some context to share about what the virtual interview experience was like with the company to help you in that preparation. My go-to advice for everybody all the time, regardless of level of employee that I've worked with, is you know yourself better than anybody. So when you're preparing for these interviews, it should be a drill, right? Whether you're interviewing at a Fortune 100 company or a startup, how you sell yourself and how you present yourself should be the same each time. or generally the same, kind of shifted to maybe the industry or something like that. So think of the like 5 to 10 hot points that you know the best about yourself, that you can talk the most about, that you most importantly, and this gets to back to your point, Beth, about answering the question, that you can provide like concrete, real, actionable examples of experiencing certain things and doing certain things throughout your career that is substance that we as recruiters can bite off and chew on, and bring to our hiring managers and say, hey, like we asked this one question and listen to these 5 other things that this person brings to the table. So know yourself, put your best foot forward, lay those 5 things out, own them, use them as examples. And the more you go through that drill, the easier it's going to be. And, you know, virtual or in person, it's going to roll right off your tongue. So that's all I got.
Appreciate it. And John, final thoughts on your end as well before we wrap up everything for the day.
The thing that I would throw out there, it's true in this environment, and really any interview environment, but I think it especially helps in this one. Anything that that just would generally help you stand out as a candidate. Eventually all the technology kind of melts away. That's why I said earlier, remember the point of the interview, and the substance is still what's most important. People start to almost forget that all this other junk is kind of standing between us. Really kind of an extension of what Mark was saying. There is so much information out there, and we don't always necessarily know how to use all of it. If you have time to really prepare, once you've gotten through the stuff that you know that you need to, the technical levels of preparation, you've prepared your answers, the things that you want to highlight, those several high-level bullet points, all that kind of stuff. The more time that you can spend, if it's a publicly traded company, looking at their or listening to their monthly earnings calls. If it's a private company, the individuals that you're going to be interviewing with, sometimes they've been on a panel at a conference someplace, or they've given a talk somewhere, or all of the, or various financial press analysts and investor analysts have written up all sorts of different pieces. It doesn't so much, people often get all that information, they don't know what to do with it. And what I often suggest is, if you spend some time doing all of that, it's not so much that you want to draw something out of that in order to be really crafty and ask a really either tricky question or a question that's going to just wow the interviewer. That body of knowledge changes the way you answer and ask questions in very, very subtle ways. The micro expressions in your face, little things in tone, confidence that you're not even aware you're projecting one way or the other. It allows you, and anyone who's been to business school has been through this, the sort of case study method, but if you're kind of thinking about the business or the organization more broadly, by looking at all that information, you feel a little bit more embedded going in. And somehow, some way, that has a way of translating in ways that you can't really fake and stage. So I would ideally put in the time, once you've done the core work that you have to do, to just suck up all of that stuff, whether it's stuff on Reddit, on Glassdoor, SEC filings, it really doesn't matter, anything. And when you're doing searches, look beyond the company's website and their PR page. You know, if you do searches on YouTube of different people's names or of certain products or whatever, and you get to see, I think it was Mark talked about mirroring a little bit, you'll even hear the language that people who work there tend to use with each other or to talk about their offerings. And that will ultimately influence you and your interviewer in ways that most people will never take the time to do.
I have one thing to add to that I wanted to mention before that I didn't, and Josh, you'll appreciate this, given your position. Utilize the alumni section of the company pages on LinkedIn.
Yes,
I can't tell you how valuable that is. Like, if you go to the Hartford's LinkedIn page, there's almost 1,000 UConn alumni currently working at the Hartford. So you think about that. I mean, we're all UConn alums here for the most part. There may be some second level connections, or maybe connections that you didn't even realize buried in the 2,000 people you're connected to that work there, that you can tap into and directly ask some of this stuff of. So that was one point that as you were talking through that stuff, it like light bulb went off and I'm like, wait a minute, we have a lot of alumni here. So using those tools is huge, and it's very easy to navigate that stuff just by going to the company's page.
Shame on us for not even thinking of that one sooner, but that's a good one.
I'm sitting right here. You stole my thunder. Come on, man. What am I supposed to say now?
Sorry.
That's why we have you guys as the experts, right? So, so that being said, huge thank you to all four of you for the time. I know we've spoken quite a few times over the last couple of months. Mark, over the last couple of hours, we've connected quite a few times. And a huge thanks for Mark for jumping in. Victoria, we hope you are feeling better at this time. And thank you so much for plowing through and joining us. We all know what it's like to be in that scenario where we're not feeling well and still plowing through and being on camera nonetheless. So thank you so much for that. For all of you that were able to join us today, if there were questions that still popped up that we did not necessarily get a chance to get to, you can go ahead and you can filter those out to the respective panelists, or you can send those through me and I'll go ahead and get those connections out. Again, we hope to see an additional number of events moving forward, from ranging in concepts from leveraging your alumni network or your network in general. Obviously, we're all working in a virtual network right now. So how do you make sure that you're tapping into that and utilizing those aspects? We do have an event scheduled for early June. I believe it's June 5th for our virtual paint night. You can get access to that by going to foundation.uconn.edu/husky-hub. Sorry, husky-hub. I want to make sure that we do it correctly. You can sign up for that. It's a virtual paint night featuring one of our alums' own picture of Horse Barn Hill, a very iconic aspect of UConn. We also have a number of other career events, like I've mentioned, coming before. We also have our panel featuring our Asian American Cultural Center Director, I Am Not the Virus, coming up. And you can find all of these as well as other virtual events as they come forward on our foundation.uconn.edu/husky-hub. And additional resources there, such as our alumni virtual cookbook, and you can submit ideas and different things like that that you want to jump into. So that being said, huge again, thank you to all of you. John, coming to us from Texas, Victoria from Arizona, Mark, Hartford, Beth, Hartford area as well. We can't thank you all enough for joining us, and for the participants, thanks for joining us, and we hope you got something from today. And we look forward to seeing all of you next time. Thanks so much. Go Huskies.
Bye.